First of all, Canada has expanded over the last 30 years. Over that period of time that we're talking about, Canada has expanded in terms of economic generation, economic development. Canada is now the 9th largest economy in the world. The concern is not that Canada has not expanded, but that during that period of time of expansion, what we have had is a growing income gap between the rich and poor. It is at its highest now than it's ever been over the last 30 years. It means that fewer and fewer people are able to take more and more income home and to concentrate more and more wealth. The bottom half particularly shut out of the income gains that we have seen, and increasingly people are working, but they are poor. We have shifted from people being out of the labor market, the majority of people who are poor being out of the labor market, to increasingly people in the labor market, poor people being in the labor market. So we have moved away from the position where I think Mike Harris suggested at some point that the problem with poverty is that we need to get poor people off of their backsides and into the labor market. They're in the labor market and they're still poor. So the major trends over that period of time is that, as Works has suggested, a growing income inequality between the sort of managerial professional class and the working class. And, oh, wow. And that growing income inequality is also reflected in by race and by gender. And I'm going to spend a bit of time just talking about that. So I want to talk about that connection between the growing income inequality and the racialization of that income inequality. A couple of things that I think are useful here. One is that what social scientists tend to use when they're talking about issues of income inequality is they use the Gini coefficient. A number of really interesting data that help in this regard. If you look at the shift in Gini coefficient from 1990 to 2006 for Canada, it is from 0.28 to 0.32. We're becoming more unequal. But the Toronto CMA is dramatically more unequal, 0.29 to 0.45. I want to suggest that part of the reason that explains that inequality is because of the extent to which the inequality within Toronto is defined by class, but rather by race, along, of course, with class. And part of that has to do with the nature of the labor market and the extent to which that labor market has become increasingly more unequal. Access to opportunity has become increasingly and persistently more unequal. And there's a number of explanations as to why that is the case. The neoliberal deregulation and re-regulation has led to this to a certain point. The persistence of, or the growth of precarious employment, temporary part-time work, low wage and no benefit types of work. And that Aboriginal racialized people tend to be disproportionately represented in the sectors where precarious employment is a major feature. And so that is reflected in their levels of unemployment and underemployment and income. So I'll very quickly run through that. I probably don't have a lot of time, but I'll run through that. So my concern here is the extent to which that leads to differential access to labor markets, income inequality, income insecurity, the racialization of poverty in particular, but other dimensions of impact, whether that is in health disparities or neighborhood segregation, and I think the important dialectical outcome, which is the communities have been organizing and mobilizing to fight back, and certainly that is the case with regard to what's been happening with Metro Toronto Chinese Legal Clinic. Okay, so just a few data, and then I'll step down. So one of the things that's happening in Canada is that Aboriginal populations are growing much faster than the rest of the population. And this is reflected in the growth from 1996 to 2006 from 290,000 to 538,000. But in spite of the fact that they're growing that significantly, their experience in the labor market does not reflect the strength that we would suggest comes out of that growth. In fact, what they seem to be experiencing is a regression in the labor market. Now, in 1996, the gap between racialized Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations was about 44%. It went down to about 27% in 2001, but it's gone back up to about 30%. That gap is also reflected in the sort of urban and rural populations. If you you will notice that the urban population of Aboriginal residents has actually a higher level of income gap than the rural population. There's a lot of unpacking that needs to be done there, but I can't get into that. Okay, so let me just end by talking a bit about a study that we did recently with Sheila Block that looks at a variety of indicators of socioeconomic status, employment by race and gender, employment rates by racialized group, and others. So quickly, the unemployment rates, the differentials in terms of unemployment rates for racialized groups, both women and men, is significant. Amongst men, it is 7.8% for racialized men, and amongst women, it's 9.3%. That is the level of unemployment. And it is lower for non-racialized men and women, 6.3% and 6.1%. That sort of reflects in when you disaggregate that, and one of the things that we're trying to do increasingly these days is to do a disaggregation of this data so that we have a sense as to what's happening to particular communities as opposed to simply dealing with that broad category. So if you disaggregate, what you see is that that experience is right common across the board except for the Filipinos and Japanese, and I know that that's coming. So employment, let me just do employment income, which is for amongst men, racialized men are at 35,000 and non-racialized men at 45,000. Women, so these processes are highly gendered. Also, women are 25,000 and non-racialized women at 28,000. The difference between racialized women and non-racialized men is significant. It's close to about 50%. And yet we are asking these populations to coexist in the same economy, in the same market, to essentially fight for the same housing, same access in the market. And I think that is significant. So that essentially leads to the concern around low income, which is that these groups tend to have a significantly higher level of low income. On the national level, it's 19.8% versus about 6% for 6.8% for the non-racialized groups. But clearly what is consistent is right across the board, all these groups tend to experience higher levels of low income. In Toronto, it's actually even higher. It's about 28% of those groups. And to some extent, that is part of why we have been talking about this experience of low income as racialized. So when we talk about racialized poverty, what we're essentially talking about is the proportions of people in racialized communities that are living in poverty, as well as the proportion of those who are poor, who are from racialized groups. And in both cases, what we're finding is that the experience of racialized poverty is persistent. I'm going to leave it there because I'm over my time. And if people have any questions, I'll be around somewhere here. Thanks a lot.